here where he's talking about, in this case, cultural identity and diaspora, but there's elements of this which actually the series 11 directly sort of engages with, but he's saying cultural identities come from somewhere, but like everything which is historical, they undergo constant transformation. Far from being eternally fixed in some essentialized past, they're subject to the continuous play of history, culture and power. And those themes, I think, come across really quite strongly in relation to the way I've been trying to think about power in this series, so I couldn't resist having Stuart Hall's words up there. I also love this poster, Art, Life. I thought it was just very sort of the moment, and you've of course got Angela Griffin here, and then the kids having a riot, and Kim Marsh, who is one of the pupils' parents, but also a dinner lady within the school. That's Kim's son. Anyway, yeah, too much. But yeah, they've done some really interesting marketing campaigns about it, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Thank you very much. So I suppose I want to move on now a little bit. As I said, this is sort of a string of thoughts rather than something that's very, very coherent at this stage. But I want to move on, if I can, to think about the way in which this show represents the recent past on television and why that might be interesting or important or useful for us to sort of engage with. The direct sort of reference to the real, including which you saw a little bit of, the sort of toppling of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol as a sort of slave trader in 2020, the anti-racism protests, Black Lives Matter protests, which are really sort of prominent, particularly in this first episode. They do become less prominent as the series works through, so I would say one of the potential constraints or flaws, perhaps, if that's the right word, I'm not sure it is, but with this series is that some storylines are worked through quite significantly and others sort of explode but then feel like they've dropped off a little bit. But I thought it was interesting that obviously there's this real tendency and reference to the real here. And particularly in terms of representation of issues for young audiences, I was able to sit in on some BBC audience interviews with different demographics, so sort of 18 to 35s, 35 to 50, and then I think 50 to 65 or 70. And one of the things that was really interesting is that in particular the younger audience said, when they were asked about this, they were obviously asked to watch it, and they were asked questions about specific characters, specific storylines. But one of the things that they kept coming back to was they kept saying, this is really relatable. And I thought, at the time I sort of thought, that's really interesting, not because they're saying it's relatable, but I suppose the thing that was occurring to me that I've not worked through yet in my head is, what does that mean for TV? If it's relatable, is that a good thing? Are there constraints associated with representations on TV being relatable in terms of what they can then offer up in terms of empathy or perhaps standing in somebody else's shoes? So I've not worked that through yet, but I just wanted to sort of say it because I don't know, it might be sort of interesting perhaps, but there are very specific sort of storylines and themes running through Series 11, particularly in relation to racism, insecure housing and sort of homelessness, knife crime, neurodiversity, lots of other things as well actually, but they're dominantly resolved in this serial. And I was thinking about that in relation to sort of what Karen Lowy described as youthfulness and the way in which that's a mediated construction, particularly in relation to television. And Lowy talks about, youthfulness as being, attitude, a series of traits, habits and beliefs. And in terms of the way in which that's surfaced here, we see the intensity of emotion, particularly within a sort of melodramatic framing or structure, as well as a soap structure, really really significantly. We've got a real meld of sort of genres going on here, which in itself is sort of interesting, but we often, I think, in youth television see this real focus upon emotion and authenticity, but the intensity of it here is really significant, and so there's an interesting sort of construction in relation to attitudes and responses to difficult situations, which I think is different from some other television, and I'm still trying to work out exactly the ways in which that is. So hopefully I'll be able to say more about that at some point. The Guardian, talking about Waterloo Road, said, or one of the reviews said, it was really jarring because they said there's social issues in a soapy setting. And they sort of said that as if it's a negative thing. And I was like, hello, my favourite TV. Okay, but it was interesting that they sort of framed it in that way, so that they found that really problematic. And whether they were looking for more realism, I'm not sure. That wasn't entirely clear. But that got me thinking about this notion about social issues in a soapy setting. What Waterloo Road is, this particular reboot of it, is it trying to be a sort of state of the nation critique, or is it a serial drama that's reimagining specific events? Or so you know, one of the things that's interesting to me is, is it really about the nation, or is it really about specific events, and how those things flip in different episodes? And I was also thinking about reverberations of the recent past and how they sort of echo through the series in different episodes, at times coming to a head and exploding, and at times sort of, you know, abating. And it made me think about Amy Holdsworth's work, where she's talking about patterns of return and retreat, which structure both the story world and the medium television itself, and how that's particularly sort of visible, I think, and almost palpable within this series. Thank you, Elke. In terms of just saying a little bit more about some of the social and cultural anxieties that the series engages with, the meaning of the past and the present, the meaning of the past and indeed the present that we're in, I think one of the complexities, one of the challenges of trying to represent the recent past on TV is that we can't ascertain the meaning of those necessarily at the time. Sometimes that takes quite a lot of time. It can take years to really understand what a moment means, or what a particular sort of event or, you know, movement might mean, and how that might look in sort of context. So on the one hand, it's interesting that they've decided to not worry about controversy, perhaps almost court controversy in a way, in terms of critics, not actual controversy, in terms of really engaging with notions of protest, and the pulling down of statues in the series, really engaging with the sort of demands for places and people and buildings and locations to be renamed and taken out of the sort of, you know, the sort of structural dominancy of basically white supremacy. So it's quite interesting in lots of ways that they're doing that, but equally it's difficult for us to understand what those moments mean in context, even though they're powerful. And I'm not saying they shouldn't do it, but it's an interesting choice. I think there's often a lot of controversy attached to when the recent past is recreated on TV, although we are seeing that more and more and more, I think, particularly over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. But there's anxieties regarding power, which have been framed by several sort of critics in relation to this series as a problem of wokeness, a problem of sort of snowflake culture. So these are just a couple of, I mean, you know, apologise for having the sun up, particularly when it's sacrilege. It's only to, you know, to critique it. But, you know, Waterloo woke, Waterloo Road viewers rage, never watching again as they blast the woke BBC for insulting fans' intelligence. Waterloo Road's woke reboot divides fans as the new series debuts with racism and rioting storyline. And then this notion about it being labelling it as being too woke and trying too hard to be relevant some other people have argued otherwise. And then the latest battlefront in the culture wars, the school playground. So this was quite a lot of the discursive context that surrounded the sort of launch of the series. And of course, part of that is bound up with, I think, other social anxieties about television and the fact that rather than commissioning original television, that we're getting reboots after reboot, which I know Charlotte Moore at the BBC had sort of railed against and said, well, actually, you've got to be really imaginative when you reboot TV. It's considered quite straightforward. We can think about that perhaps more. But yeah, these sort of social and cultural anxieties aren't just dealt with within the series. There's also this sort of, I suppose, this critical and paratextual context in which these issues are also being pushed. Thank you very much. And of course, that's also interesting in terms of the fact that in the series we get these structural and cultural and social issues that are solved for the most part through this series, and they're solved through empathy, they're solved through support, and they're solved through sort of negotiation and mutual trust and learning. But of course, in real life, those issues are not as sort of easy to solve. In lots of ways, I think this series uses the local as a sort of anchor, as a sort of almost recuperative anchor to sort of say, oh, well, I know this might be, anchor being a problem for hundreds of years, but we can make this nice within this sort of small community and, within this sort of representation of a very specific type of northernness that it's offering up. But again, this focus on emotion as a central structuring device, assertions of identity, negotiations of pleasures are all sort of are all really prominent, and it just made me think, what might the drama expose about what Christine Geraghty has called the absence elsewhere, the sensibility, if you will, of what's left unsaid. Basically, broadcaster anxieties around the place of public service broadcasting in the future television landscape, even perhaps in the present television landscape. I don't have definitive answers to these. I'm hoping the questions are more interesting than the answers. Thank you very much, Elke. Again, when I was sort of trying to think this through, the quote that came into my mind, the theories that came into my mind was Sian Nye, who in her work on ugly feelings really pays attention to anxiety as an emotion that's expectant, and I think there's so much expectant anxiety within Waterloo Road. That was why this sort of, I suppose, really spoke to me when I was thinking about the series. So something anticipatory, linked to time, and then sort of drawing on Ernest Bloch and Louis Althusser. Nye goes on to describe anxiety as aligned with the concept of futurity. Is that how you pronounce it? Futurity. And the temporal dynamics of deferral and anticipation in particular, but also as having this spatial dimension. And I think there is some really interesting stuff about space and place, which I don't really have time to talk about in the paper today, but we can. As she explains, anxiety is a quality or feeling the subject refuses to recognise in himself and attempts to locate in another person or thing. And so when I was watching this, and the sort of prominence of cultural, social, political, structural anxieties, I'm thinking about what's missing in terms of what it says perhaps about public service broadcasting and the anxieties of broadcasters. It just made me think about this notion of ugly feelings and how I might try to develop that in terms of moving this forward. Thank you very much. I'm nearly done. So there is a sense, I think, of recuperation that we can sort of get a sense of through Waterloo Road, and the way in which I think perhaps the BBC and Rope Ladder Productions recuperate some of these anxieties, or at least contains them perhaps, is through place, this focus on place, through production and particular production practices, and also through some of its casting. So it's just worth me saying that this was filmed in Swinton, which is an area of Greater Manchester, Swinton is classed as a very sort of low-income neighbourhood. Even though we know that, you know, Manchester has a very established now TV, you know, culture industry, you know, it is a sort of, you know, the BBC's second home. Swinton is absolutely not it's a very different place. And I know when Sarah and I were thinking about this when we were doing a little bit of work on this a while ago, I was like, oh my gosh, it's in Swinton. That's where my father-in-law lives. I was like, Dad. So they filmed in Swinton in Greater Manchester, which was quite a different choice. And I can talk about that later if you'd like. But I think the place is important, this notion and focus on the local and sort of saying, okay, well, what we're trying to do with this production is really change local communities. And you know, we can think about the success of that or lack thereof. There was a focus on the development of creative talent that the BBC and the production company talks about a lot. So support of 20 trainees across a range of craft areas. They did quite a bit of outreach at local schools, both the BBC and the production company. There was also stepping up schemes across script writing, directing and production. And you can only do this on this type of continuing serial drama. It's impossible to do on sort of shorter shows, or maybe not impossible, but not on this scale. So basically, you know, they were trying to create a training environment, a little bit like what Doctors used to be, you know, 15, 20 years ago. But that couldn't sustain it either because the need to get out episodes is just too much. So there was this sense of a very clear ethos of change that both the BBC and the production company talked about. There's this clear sense of Northern voices reflected both on and off screen. 84% of the crew spend was in the region. Crowd casting was drawn hugely from local communities, schools, colleges, youth groups, including the basketball team from Manchester College. Series 12 is airing now. There's this sense about building tolerance, inclusivity and respect that's at the heart of what Kim, Angela Griffin, says the school is about. And this is mirrored by the BBC and the production company in terms of what they were trying to do here and why and how it matters. I think I should stop there. Thank you so much.
Sarah is currently completing her PhD at Leeds University, supervised by Beth and Kristen, and she's literally in the process of writing up. So this is exciting. We're getting the big exciting.
We just talked about anxiety a little bit too. Thank you so much. Yes, super happy to be here. Yes, so exactly. And my research is situated in television studies, of course, and revolves around female characters in sort of contemporary, complex or prestige shows, which, as I briefly mentioned yesterday at some point in conversation, is a whole thing in itself in television studies as well. Why do we have to do this, especially, you know, and how does it work when there's half-hour female-centric shows that we're talking about? And yeah, but so there's an interest in the aesthetics and affect of contemporary TV, and then of course a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is how sort of power structures are played out within this narrative, but then also a little bit behind. But I'm going to stick to the narrative for the most part because that's usually what I do. So yes, so thank you so much. For anyone who hasn't seen it, because there is too much TV out there, and you know, I know. And all 8 episodes of Undone's first season, so this is the show, it's called Undone. They were all released on September 13th, 2019. The second season then, again, all at once, April 29th, 2022. So there was a little gap in between, of course, because of COVID. And Undone explores, as it says about itself, the elastic nature of reality through its central character, Alma. After getting into a nearly fatal car crash, Alma discovers she has a new relationship with time and uses this ability to find out the truth about her father's death. So much happening there. Running times of all episodes are between 22 and 26 minutes, and each episode was extremely carefully storyboarded before shooting, which is kind of interesting as well. So yes, so on the next slide, yes, here you can see a video, a still from a video that's on YouTube where you know, the director of and sort of creator of this, Hisco Holsing, he explains all of the elements that kind of went into making the show. So you really have really careful storyboarding because it's so expensive to do. Layouts, there's floor plans, digital designs, live action recordings, and the rotoscoping, of course, is the sort of big thing that's happening. Most people know rotoscoping or what it looks like from a scanner darkly. The 2006 Linklater movie, where you really had, you know, Keanu Reeves and Winona Ryder and the other people that, you know, aren't as important as those two, that just really do all of the acting, and then each frame is sort of is traced over. So and here you have a little bit more than this. So the biggest thing that's a little bit different about this is that every single background, and we'll see that in the clip later, but every single background of every single frame is in oil painting. So they got about 11 classically trained painters to do all of the backgrounds for everything. So everything is in oil painting. And then later, the style of what is rotoscoped and what has actually been acted out, and the oil paintings are, you know, digitally. There's so much happening, and so what you have is in all of the scenes of the show, because you have that same background. So no matter whether there's a regular domestic setting or something wild where Alma floats in space, which is just the storyboarding here, everything has the same feel to it, so to speak. So that's how that really contributes very well to not being sure as the audience, just as Alma isn't sure what's real, what might be parts of her psychosis or memory or dream. So that's actually, that works really well. And yes, and then a fun fact for anyone who's interested specifically in performance on television as well. What they did as well here is that, because they, exactly, yes, thank you. So they didn't have to really do any big set changes. So on other shows, sometimes, you know, the actors sit around for hours looking at their phones while the sets are being changed or whatever happens. And here they said that for the actors, it was much more like actually playing theater, because they were just really sometimes performing for hours and hours, because there are almost no props, there's nothing to change. So that was pretty interesting too. So yes, and if you go to the next slide, and then if you want to, you can just like go back and forward a couple of times. Yes, so this is what it looks like when you know, Rosa Salazar, the actress, just kind of runs through this corridor that doesn't exist, and then what it looks like later on. Thank you so much. Amazing. Oh yes, and then we can go to the next one after. Perfect. Thank you. So yeah, really, really interesting, just yeah, in terms of how it's made. The story world's complex temporal and spatial structure feature time travel and time loops. So that's blurring reality with memories and dreams as well. And then, so we have Alma as our focalizer throughout the entire story. So she's really our female subject. We are feeling with her a lot of the time, maybe, with a different perception of reality due to what is hinted to be schizophrenia. So in terms of my 3 case studies, those 2, which is Undone, and then another show is Russian Doll, which people might know, both shows, especially more in their respective second seasons, apart from featuring the Holocaust very heavily, also do much more of that sort of explaining, which people don't appreciate as much, but that's another discussion. But yeah, both shows feature the idea of schizophrenia. Very interesting as well, very postmodernism-y. So yes, so what Undone does as well through this is it exemplifies Dobson and Khanna's assertion that the portrayal of young women's mental health in recent female-centered TV shows is perhaps a space where the tension between a neoliberal affective orientation individualism. I need to, you know, just sort of keep calm and carry on. And the reflective questioning of such. So, oh, but also this really sucks, and neoliberalism is the worst. Where this is really apparent, and Dobson and Kanai were arguing this in 2009 down there, and of course, you know, a little time has passed, and we're still kind of having these sorts of stories on television. And again, this is really achieved via rotoscoping and oil paintings, and then, oh yeah, I actually said that already. Oh yeah, I got into the middle stuff. So yes, the gendered implications of this and of the time loops and the multiverse and the split self as narrative devices is then really just worth exploring. And this component of the mad woman in these stories and in these shows. And then in terms of how neoliberal structures of feeling and mad experiences and ugly feelings can go together. Specifically on television, I also, you know, agree very much with them when they argue for more exploration in terms of the further cementing of young women's alienation and how such representation may puncture the cruel optimism and taken for grantedness of happiness of neoliberal can-do subject trajectories, success trajectories. Okay, thank you. Yes, so this is just another one of the neoliberalism slides. So yeah, capitalist context. We kind of know this already. This is just a scene or a still from a scene to illustrate this, where Alma tries on Becca, her sister's engagement ring, and feigns interest for a second before just calling it a blood diamond, and that's also why Alma is one of those interesting characters from the last couple of years, who really, to use Sarah Ahmed's term, very often acts as a feminist killjoy. So I kind of really like that. Yes, so yes, on the next slide you can see a few, thank you, a few of the, so my case studies are on the right basically, so those are the three things, and then you have some of these sort of more or less typical women-centric half-hour TV shows from the slightly earlier years of the 2000s. So usually when someone said to you, oh, it's women-centric and it's a half an hour, you would usually think about Sex and the City, and then of course there was Girls, and then Broad City, which I prefer to both of the other ones, but on the other hand, maybe also wouldn't have existed without the other two. It all connects. So yeah, this is very interesting, and I would say that there's too many shows out there to really make this observation in a way that couldn't be picked apart by anyone. But anyways, there has been, I would say, a noticeable shift in recent years to sort of model half-hour female-led programs more and more after complex hour dramas, just with a darker tone, more complex characters, and narratives, more generic experimentation perhaps, and in many cases with a central mystery, which you have in all three of my case studies. There's usually a little bit of a murder thing going on, and then that mystery usually serves as more or less a MacGuffin-like narrative device to propel character journeys and explorations of selves. So really what you end up having anyway is a lot of domestic drama, a lot of family drama, and then again explorations of these psyches of these women. So yes, okay. And then, yes, and here you can see also a little bit, so this is something I'm really interested in, is that fragmented self or split self, which happens in all of my three case studies, but then also, as you can just see here, has been used a lot, so it's become really tropey. People have been pointing this out as well, that it's maybe happening a little too much, and maybe we should stop doing the physical, visual splits of these characters and basically everything. The latest one is a serial version. It's a mini-series, but it's on Amazon Prime, which you can see sort of in the middle on the right, which is the two Rachel and Wise characters here. So Dead Ringers is, which you can see just down there with Jeremy Irons, a 1988 body horror movie by David Cronenberg. But now it's also a TV show featuring Rachel Weisz as the twin psychologists on Amazon Prime. So there's really a reworking of a lot of these narratives as well, and then just the idea of a sort of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of thing, which you used to have in things like American Psycho or Fight Club, and now you have all of this really interesting stuff happening to women. And then in the middle, of course, the hugest thing that's happened in terms of the multiverse of many selves was definitely Everything Everywhere All at Once, which won all of the awards. Yay! Okay, and yes, just to illustrate that again, Search Party, Russian Doll, I'm done, whatever. And then a couple of other things as well from the last couple of years. So we had The Flight Attendant, where the main character often spends sort of time to reflect in sort of a memory palace where she talks to different versions of herself. And then in Severance, I don't want to say too much about that because that is a big reveal in the last episode. And then Made for Love, a very another short-lived drama on HBO Max, only half an hour long. It's all happening. So many characters just splitting up. And then in terms of power structures and familial relationships between characters and their dads, their boyfriends, which also happens in all of these to a large extent, I now have a clip. And maybe, yes, yes.
Look, I know that doesn't make any sense, but you know what I'm saying. The truth is I was scared, and you had just been through so much, and...
You know what? I'm so tired of people making decisions for me.
Look, I just wanted to create a normal and stable environment for you, that's all.
A stable environment where you're lying to me and having sex with me?
Yeah, to help you. Was I supposed to not have sex with you? You would have thought something was weird.
Something was weird. And what about the roller coaster photos? You swore you hadn't moved them. You made me feel like I was insane.
Please, don't be mad.
Don't be mad. You lied. Like a lot, like elaborately lied to me.
Look, I didn't know what to do, okay? You were in the hospital, and I was really scared. You don't know how scary that was for me.
How scary that was for you?
I guess I should have been more honest.
You guessed.
I should have been more honest. But you were really happy to see me. You wanted me to be there. I just wanted everything to be okay.
Well, you're terrible at making things okay.
Can we just acknowledge that things have been complicated for the both of us?
Great. What am I doing? Sam?
Sanjeev, வா pack பண்ணலாம் நம்ம.
This isn't even your memory. What are you doing here?
I don't know. I feel like I'm working through something.
But this is not a great time to be boy crazy.
That's not what this is.
Just use the blackjack game, you know? Anchor yourself.
No.
எல்லார்கிட்டயும் குட் பை சொல்லிட்டியா சஞ்சீவ்?
இல்ல இன்னும் சொல்லல.
இன்னும் சொல்லலையா? நம்ம நாளைக்கு கிளம்பணும்.
நீ எங்க போற? நாங்க இந்தியா விட்டு USA சிகாகோக்கு போறோம். நாளைக்கா? ஆமா. ஏன் என்கிட்ட சொல்லல? ஏன்னா எனக்கு போகவே வேண்டாம். அப்ப போகாத. ஆமா எங்க கூடயே இரு.
சரி போதும் நம்ம போய் பேக் பண்ணலாம்.
Okay, Anna, we need to go. We need to go pick up your sister. Okay, come on. Let's go. Let's go. Punch buggy. Punch buggy. Why are you doing this? Please stop. It's called punch bug, you idiot. That doesn't give me more information.
That doesn't give me more information. Where? I'm a baby.
I don't sound like that. I don't sound like that.
Pop. Top. Mop.
Pop, top, mop.
Good, Alma. Say you're sorry.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, said the little duck. I'm sorry, said the little duck.
I'm sorry, said the little duck.
I'm sorry, said the little duck.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, said the little duck.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Alma.
Yeah, too much happening there. Thank you so much. And also I realized it was a pretty long clip. Which hopefully, oh, that's perfect, which hopefully illustrated the sort of time loopiness a little bit. So you really had her leaving the room and then all of a sudden being back in Sam's childhood, her boyfriend's childhood, and then you had all kinds of different timelines where both of their sort of childhoods intersected, and then you have her back there, and then what happens afterwards is that she's not really mad at him anymore. So really, really interesting the way that this articulates how Alma relates to others, especially in this season where there's so much about her relationship with her dead father, Bob Odenkirk, you saw there, who is teaching her to time travel, and then with her boyfriend. She's navigating these relationships simultaneously. There's a scene in the same episode that you can see here, where Alma is in a different kind of memory with her father, but at the same time, she is engaged in this same fight with Sam that you saw part of in that previous clip. And so at some point, Sam's head just emerges out of one of those ruins in Mexico, where they are in this memory, because Alma's environment is, in fact, yeah, very, very unstable, even though Sam tried to create a stable environment by lying to her and also having sex with her. And then, yes, and then the way that this happens also really, in a formal context, expresses the way that time loops and this kind of time travel operate in a way that TV is a kind of folded media with a nonlinearity that is akin to a process of spiraling, looping, or doubling. Undone takes this very literally, continually moving backward and forward. So the process here is like the most recent celebrations of television serial characters, cumulative, distinguished by an iterative process of repetition that is lived over time. And then Amy Holdsworth here is talking about repetition and iteration that define TV. And then recent shows like Undone or Russian Doll are particularly fascinating because they've got such short seasons and running times. So one way to think about the work that these loops and these shows do might be that they're just going a different way about doing those loops and about doing time in that way that longer-running TV shows have been doing due to their longer episodes and number of seasons. Okay, nice. I'm almost, yeah, we're getting very close now. So in that way, time is also important to them because with its ambivalent protagonist who does not want to have it all, it also fits well into that post-recessional TV landscape that can be described as consistently problematizing the neoliberal feminist ideals or feeling rules connected to broader logics of self-belief, positive thinking, the pursuit of happiness, noted as pervasive in recent neoliberal and meritocratic cultural discourse of self-making. That's again Dobson and Kanai, like from the slide earlier. And then Alma's resistance to chrononormativity, the idea that things should happen at certain times in everyone's life, especially for heteronormative people, and the ways in which this half-hour show, with only 8 episodes per season, does that kind of looping, spiraling, or doubling that TV is capable of, can perhaps tell us more about where world building and storytelling and television is headed. You know, when it comes to shorter episodes and seasons, that can be and are intended to be binged. So really, that's, yeah, that's, we're way past it. Thank you very much.
put their cameras on. That would be really nice. And then, hi, good morning. And then Jackie instantly has a question, which is brilliant. So go ahead. And sorry, Sarah, do you think you could maybe sit here? Because then they can see you. You just have you back there. There we go. Okay, so Jackie, go ahead. Ask your question. Oh, this. You're still muted?
Thank you for pointing that out. See my lips moving and no sounds coming out. So thank you for your papers. It was great. One of the things I do, as well as being a researcher, is I teach in the secondary school. So I was particularly interested with your paper, Beth. And I just wondered, because I know you said the Guardian criticised the programme for being soapy, but there's a lot of truth in what the programme's reflected. And I'm wondering if there's been any reaction from any government departments or any comment from any government departments about, you know, the what I perceive as the ethos of schools and the function of our education system being challenged, and necessarily so. But the Department of Education doesn't seem to be making comments, but Waterloo Road is reflecting what's happening in schools, where there's a lot of young people disillusioned. They don't feel that the education system is preparing them for the kind of life they're anticipating for themselves. And I just wonder if there's any intention from the producers to actually trigger and engage in a discussion or debate with educational ministerial departments, or whether any ministries have actually made any comment that you're aware of, which would allow us to see that, as well as the programme drawing on what's happening in society and in reality, whether it's actually going to feed the other way and influence what's happening in education policy.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that question, Jacqueline. As far as I know, there is engagement with the government. Well, I know there's engagement with the government, but interestingly, it's not around education. It's around tax credits, and it's around television, and it's about doing production better, by which equates to having more production outside of London, but also more diversity off screen as well as on screen. But this notion of embedding productions within local communities where there isn't already an established community, so that there are community benefits for local suppliers, as well as educational establishments. That's the engagement that's happened so far that I'm aware of. It's really interesting that you've asked about education. I mean, I know that as part of that engagement, one of the things that was discussed, there was 2 MPs there, I think, as well as colleagues from the BBC and from Rope Ladder, and they talked about the fact that they'd been and spoken to teachers before they had rebooted this series, particularly teachers in inner city sort of schools, which were in the locale in which they were filming, to try and get the sense of I suppose the authenticity of many of the challenges facing people. But I don't, as far as I know, there's not been any engagement in terms of educational policy, which is you know, such a great question, because yeah, I think while it maybe doesn't do the things it sets out to do, it does have something really valuable to say. And what it's saying is about learning and unlearning, and about structures of education, and in some ways the structural failure of education, not necessarily through the faults of educators themselves, but the systems are broken, that they're sort of working within, and they obviously link to systems of care, support, diagnosis. So there is something very structural that it's addressing, that is, I think, perhaps not the key priority, but actually arguably it maybe does that better than maybe some of the things it tries to make a key priority. I'll be really interested to see if there's further engagement in that direction. I'm sorry I don't know any more, but thank you for a really great question.
Dan?
Do you need me to speak up now?
No, I think, can you guys hear now okay?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great.
Great.
Thank you both for those papers. I really enjoyed them both. This is a question for Beth, and I'll preface it by saying I've only seen the first 2 episodes of the new Waterloo Road, so if what I ask is totally undercut by what happens later, let me know.
No.
I was struck by the concept, the kind of absence of elsewhere, Christine Gerrit's concept, and undercurrent of anxiety you associate with it. And I totally agree. And I was wondering, I agree the way you sort of frame the regionality of the show, and that was kind of the northernness maybe as a way of sort of mitigating that, the local. And I was interested if you can also kind of flip it the other way, where the youth setting, the school, is a way of kind of grounding these issues of imagining future forms of identity, progressive politics, in a setting that is kind of taken away from maybe a more anxious context of like economics, post-industrial North. I know it's on the margins a little bit of Waterloo Road. There's like Dante's character loses a car because of various. I've been thinking a lot about kind of representations of the North and school settings as a way of sort of raising issues and extracting it from a wider context. I don't know if you've seen the new Full Monty.
I haven't yet.
Which kind of tries to do both at the same time in a weird way. And I was just interested then, I guess, what do you think about the kind of youth setting as a way of dealing with these issues? Could you imagine a Waterloo Road that's more expansive and tries to deal with issues of identity and sort of put it in a sort of wider northern working class context? Or is that a kind of absence of elsewhere is also that wider context? I hope that makes sense.
It really does. It's such an interesting question. I absolutely get what you mean about the fact that within the context of a school, while we see while we see structural problems surface, there is also an element of safety and sanitisation to an extent that provides, which perhaps helps with the resolves that for the most part sort of come. But the notion of what does it sort of say about, what does it say about the North? I think that I think you've got a really good point in that while it is northern and the production company and the BBC were, Manchester was the actual, was the chosen place, and we see, lots of red brick houses and we hear local accents. There is a sense of the North that is absolutely missing from that. It's almost stripped out in some ways. To I think speak to or try to speak to a full nation.
Yeah.
And what we know from other different telly is that place-specific drama, I'm thinking about like Happy Valley, can speak not just locally, but nationally, locally. So, but is doing something. It is doing something. Something which means that while it's northern, at the same time, the northernness lacks a depth, and I don't know if that's partly because of the sort of. I don't think it's because of the genre mix, or sort of melding, but there is a flatness in terms of perhaps how we might be more familiar with seeing northern communities, and I really want to think about that more. But thank you for bringing that up, because I think, yeah, while there's this real, I mean, in terms of the production team, they're like, this has to be northernness and class are hard baked in this series, and I think there are, so in episode 2, which I think you'll have.
I think that's.
Did you see the funeral one?
Yeah.
So you'll have seen that moment where you get. I couldn't quite work out what relative she was of Dante, but the lady, I don't know if she was a mum or an auntie or whatever, but she plays an absolute, almost stereotypical Mancunian woman, and it reminded me when I saw that character. Reminded me of Aveline from Bread. It was as it felt like a character from 18. I mean, Bread was amazing, but it was of its time, and it felt like almost that character being transplanted from Liverpool to Manchester, and you know so there is something that's missing. That absence is absolutely there in other ways, which I think is what you were pointing to, and that's great, because that's going to really help me to think about it more.
Well, thank you. It felt totally incoherent when I was thinking of it, so but definitely that kind of safety, the intersecting safety of sort of genre and sort of place, that, because the obvious other one was Ackley Bridge, which I think does it maybe better than Waterloo Road, if that's a bit crude way of saying it, but it definitely, that youth school setting seems to me to be like, provides a kind of safe microcosm at times, where you don't then have to put it in a kind of broader national issue.
It contains it a bit.
Yeah, definitely. That's a better way to put it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Beth.
Roy?
So this is a not very worked out question for both of you, about what relatability does. So questions of relatability in terms of PSB, particularly, and how that runs throughout all the genre, but and it's also a question about relatability in youth. So youth is running through the kind of history of school dramas, obviously, but also what you were saying just now about how a lot of these character tropes seem to be picked, seem to have a very long historical line. They're actually not very new, and that perhaps makes them not very radical. And is relatability almost anti-radical if they are using kind of Holdsworth's conception of repetition and looping, and what that does sort of in that discussion that might not be articulated but takes place in the home when you're watching, around what these radical and non-radical ideas can give. And particularly with the figure of the young woman, I kept thinking when you were talking about the sister in Transparent as well, and how she negotiates her own really limited identity that's really fractured. But of course the focus isn't on her fracturing, it's on everyone else's. And how there's almost a constraint there, and how you because she's a middle-aged woman having a very youthful experience, what does that do to fractional young women? Where are they allowed their own identity? And so this isn't very worked out. It was just what I was thinking as you were talking.
Yes, I was also again thinking about relatability when Beth talked about it, because there's so many different settings where people talk about this and where I talk about it with people. And then relatability also, it just has that feeling of being seen when people say, oh, I feel really seen in this. Or I can relate to this. And then Mita at some point yesterday was talking about this as well. And this is why I want to know more about her audience studies. Because it really seems it is so important for us to actually be able to align with certain characters sometimes, or it just makes us so happy when we see people who are a little bit like us, which is problematic in different ways, I guess, as well, because we also need to see and want to see people who are very different from us. But this is something that I talk about with people in a sort of math studies setting as well, where we talk about those depictions and articulations of mental health struggles, for example. I'm going on a tangent here, but which is interesting because we often then talk about the difference between representation and presentation, where we often then say, okay, we like this show, we like how this show does it, for example, in this season, because it presents something along the lines of, let's say, schizophrenia or depression or anxiety or suicidality to us in a way that makes us relate, but that doesn't feel like it's telling us how it should work for us as well, versus, lots of shows that kind of do it in a didactic way, which then makes me think about how often there's this idea that high school shows or shows aimed at a younger audience actually do this kind of didactically more, where it's more representational versus presentational, and then that's then used by people who say, okay, this is just too woke, this is not good, but is there also actually maybe a lot of worth in that? But there's actually, I definitely did go on a tangent there now. Beth, do you also?
I was thinking about your case study, or case studies, Sarah, and I was thinking about that notion of relatability. And one of the things that I suppose that I sort of would like to ask about, sorry, I'm going to string a sentence together, is I was thinking about how the aesthetics, particularly those beautiful painted backgrounds, how they impact relatability. Does that mean that maybe audiences focus more upon the emotional connection, or actually does it provide a sort of a safe distance from which to watch? And if that is the case, does it then become voyeuristic, but maybe not in a slightly different way because the visual is less real, or the backdrop's less real, but the issues are then more foregrounded? And in terms of relatability, I was just thinking about how that context and the sort of aesthetic of undoes relatability, I suppose. But I don't know the answer to that. I was thinking about that clip you showed.
Yes, that was an interesting thing as well in that really long video about how it's made that I watched about 80 times. They also talk about how they really wanted to make sure that the audience feels with the characters, and that was one of the big challenges. So they were showing sort of as a comparison a couple of stills or clips from A Scanner Darkly and a few other rotoscope things. And then that's my usual problem with animation that I have, that I often go at animation thinking, oh, it's not gonna be as relatable as real people as well. And in this case, I really thought that it was very relatable because, and it was before, but it was even more after. Again, I saw this sort of paratext explaining how it was done. When they said, oh, actually, we went through a million more hoops sort of to get the facial expressions of the characters done, and then in post-production done in a way that made them more expressive than in other rotoscope things. Also so that the characters wouldn't feel the need to overact anything, so that they could really act well in the show. That was really interesting to me. And it's funny too, because I think it was actually Karen Lurie just at the Screen Conference a few days ago, who after the presentation asked, oh, does the rotoscoping or the animation do anything in this show in terms of infantilizing the female characters? And I found that question really interesting because I never had thought about that. It didn't feel like that to me, but it definitely, maybe there's some truth to that as well. Like, what does animation do when you are exploring the female characters? Oh, and then also what Rowan said about sort of, for example, character sisters and other characters in the shows. That's so funny too, because in this show, you so often have the main character being, this really tortured person that's really struggling with everything, and then that character is maybe visually split. But then, of course, what you also have and what you used to have in Sex and the City is you have different characters just kind of expressing different facets that could also all be one person. And in these cases, it's often kind of simplified as well. Like Becca, the almost sister in that show, very much, on a specific trajectory. We don't actually know what her work is, but it's going well as far as we know. She's about to get married, but then actually that crumbles apart a little bit later on. But I'll stop rambling now.
No, that was really interesting. And in terms of that question, which I think is a really amazing one, does relatability in the context of some of this actually, does that function as anti-radical? I would say yes, it does, because in the repetition of the sort of Colston statue moment here, there's an engagement, but the thing is, it's not the same punctum. It is a repeat in the same way that Waterloo Road itself, as this serial is being repeated and sort of brought back. So it's engaging, but it's not radical. I think it limits the radicalness of it. But interestingly, the young audiences, or the 16 to 35, what they said that they found relatable was the issues and the themes that it dealt with. But actually, I sort of said, okay, that's great. What do you find most interesting? And they said the teachers' lives. Like, that's what they really were like. That for them felt radical, because they were peeping behind, or felt a sense of peeping behind lives that they felt they didn't know, and that I think did feel radical. And I suppose that sort of proves your point in a way, that while the repetition can be powerful of those key political moments in the reel, actually it's when we are offered a different perspective or a different way of seeing or being, or that actually I think there's more, I don't know if it is radical or it feels more radical, but there is something, really.
Potential.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Hey, Laura.
Yeah, both fantastic papers. Beth, I was just thinking about Black Lives Matter and protests, and is there any other British TV shows that are doing this? Just because, we have, I know the reboot of Gossip Girl did it, and it got really criticised for it, and something called Grownish, and they're both on cable TV in America. I'm just wondering how that would contrast with. Just interested that, on the other side of the pond they've explored, those themes and elements, and if there's anything over here, or if it's just.
That's such a great question. I haven't seen anything that does this, but there may be. I feel so pathetically behind. I'm like,
no one's keeping up with it.
No, it's impossible. But I'm not. But that in itself is interesting, isn't it? Because again, it sort of speaks to this absence elsewhere. So it's trying to do something potentially radical, but actually it's not radical because it's repetition. And there's a gap, and part of that gap is this is actually a really difficult moment to represent in ways that potentially feel authentic to often very different audiences under, you know, a sort of, you know, under one audience.
Yeah, because like Gossip Girl was like heavily criticised because they were like, just why, you know, upper class students and it's very, like I say,
white saviour.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I wondered how that contrasted with sort of maybe Waterloo Road, where they are sort of, you know, a different class, and maybe if that's more authentic, and if that relates to that being on cable TV and this is TSB, and it's kind of very old school in that divide in a way.
Yeah, and I think that thing about maybe the sort of notion of youth TV and a movement maybe or a shift which from perhaps the sort of what's perceived to be the more privileged millennial to a different generation and the sort of experiences of that generation. I suppose one of the things that I was really keen to find out about in relation to Waterloo Road is we know that television, film, you know, on-screen representations can often present one thing on screen and then have a very different, you know, culture, community off screen. So, you know, that the idea of the, I suppose the politics of creative diversity and visibility, which are also important in trying to understand what the show is trying to do and how that's matched or not off screen, and also I suppose what work is it doing for the BBC and for the production company, because ultimately it is Waterloo Road is a brand, so there's really interest. But no, I haven't seen it elsewhere.
Anna has his hand up.
I have time to. Wonderful presentation, Sarah and Beth, and sorry I'm not there to see it in person. My question, I guess, it's in two parts, but comes with a comment as well. So we live in a very nationalistic era, and media is kind of reacting or embodying some of that. So I'm curious what you think of the shows that are trying to do it all rather than doing it well. And also, while they're doing it all, they are gearing towards a Gen Z, which is the most diverse generation, at least in the UK and the US, in terms of their ethnic, racial markations, but also their sensibilities towards mental health, disability, and sexuality. So I'm wondering, because Beth was also talking about that generation, what kind of responsibility these shows might have to bridge the generational gap when this, you know, the youngsters, Gen Z, is leaning very left and being very sensitive about these issues, while the older generation is turned very nationalistic and is, you know, they don't care about diversity for the most part, as we might do. So I wonder what your thoughts are, what these shows you know, supposed to do while they are trying to do everything. Is it the best idea or is it the worst idea for where we are culturally and politically?
And actually, yeah, because Beth is going to be better at this. But I was just wondering as well, because I haven't even really talked about this or done much research in because I look so much just at the narrative. But I wonder actually about, like you say, responsibility about these issues in terms of public service broadcasting versus, I mean, my 3 case studies are basically just streaming shows at this point. You know, one is on Netflix, one is on Amazon Prime, and the other one actually in the middle of it moved from TBS to HBO Max. So they're intended, so to speak, for more, or it's fine if they're just for more niche audiences anyway, especially with Undone. Usually when I present about it, people haven't seen it, people haven't heard about it at all. Sometimes people have maybe seen a trailer or promotion for it, but usually not at all. So I wonder about the practices of getting that out there, because so much in Undone it has these like little comments, little cultural commentaries in it about colonialism. It's set in San Antonio, so there's a scene where they literally just standing in front of the Alamo, and Alma is lamenting, the fact that it's about colonialism, and there's so much feminism in there. There's so much about racism in there as well, because of course Alma is mestiza, so there's a lot about that, and I do wonder about what is getting promoted more, what is getting promoted less. But then you have other shows such as Mindy Kaling's Never Have I Ever, for example, which is a very interesting US American version of a high school drama that features a non-white character with Indian heritage. So I do wonder about that kind of thing. But then, Beth, public service broadcasting, etc.
So I really like that question, and I think in terms of what you mentioned about bridging the generational gap or that generational divide, one of the interesting things that that I discovered about the intention for Waterloo Road was that while their key demographic was 16 to 35, what was also desired, although I think secondary, but that it was, also commissioned on the basis of, this is a show that will genuinely have the potential to be multi-generational because it's a reboot. So you'll have parents and kids watching this together. That has not happened in any of the data. No, I mean, I'm sure it's maybe happened on a couple of occasions, but that's not coming through in the data. But it was something that the commissioners talked about in terms of what might the potential for this reboot be. And they're looking at it from a different angle. I suppose they're thinking about bridging a gap in terms of audiences and in terms of numbers. There was a sense in which they were like, okay, well, if we deal with these, we've all been, so the thing that comes up again and again is we've all been at school, we all remember or understand that, even if we're not there now. And actually, if we can draw out these issues, then there will be a sense of perhaps better understanding across generations, but ultimately we'll also get double audiences, right? So there's this sort of, I would say balance, but maybe not balance. There was a sense of that, but I've not seen any data to suggest that that's been achieved. So, and I don't find that particularly surprising. I think that, it's a really, really difficult thing to do. And I think part of their casting strategy in terms of casting people like Angela Griffin, who, it has been, such a sort of familiar figure on British television, particularly in northern drama, for a long period of time. Part of that casting strategy, I think, in part was about northernness, and it was about class, and it was about intersectional identity. But I also think it was about trying to draw in audiences that were like, I remember Kim from the first time around. She was great. So there was definitely that. But I do think in terms of the public service element of it, what's it doing as a public service? What's its public service work? And I would go back to that notion of thinking that ultimately the public service work it does is actually around education and structural, the broken structures that are not just educational but extend into healthcare, social care, That for me is the public service work it's doing. I'm not sure on any level that was the public service work it set out to do. I don't think that's, I could be wrong, but that's not my sense from any of the sort of interviews that I've done. But I think that is the public service work. So I suppose harking right back to Jacqueline's question in the beginning, that's where the potential is for me, because, you know, that's where it's really doing something interesting. I'm not saying it's not, but that's where, yeah, that's held. Thank you.
Excellent.
We have to bring this panel to a close. We're already 3 minutes over, and I know online is always hard to follow for a while, and we just have halfway way. So let's thank the panelists again, and thank you also for the really interesting questions.